Okay, I believe we are live. Uh, welcome, Mike. This
Howdy, howdy.
is what's up. This is Praxedis. This is Midwest Unrest. We're here again to talk about some Mexican history, Borderlands history, I guess, not just Mexican. And looking forward to getting into it today. You have some topics that I don't know anything about, which is cool. I'm always down to learn. So this should be
Yeah,
fun.
I'm excited. Excited to talk about some bandits, some rebels, some folk heroes, some
Yes.
individuals that I know a little bit about. I'm not an expert, but I have to talk a little bit about them to a class tomorrow. So
All
I think
right.
this gives me a good opportunity to share a little bit and get some thoughts from you to help me kind of better know what I'm thinking about these. I think fairly interesting individuals.
Yeah, we're getting some free. All of our subscribers are getting a free education. um, right on. Okay, so I think you had two bandits you sent me the name of that you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of like folk heroes figures in the Mexican American borderlands areas in California and Texas and also on the other side of the border in Mexico, in northern Mexico. I don't know who I sent you. I've got, Juan Cortina, who was on both sides of the border. Tiburcio Vasquez was from California. Gregorio Cortez was from Texas. Um, Joaquin Murrieta, who was possibly, if this was even a story that was real, from California. And you've heard of like Pancho Villa,
Of
Dorotea
course.
Arango. His story, he kind of has a similar story that fits into the mold of these, this sort of archetypal folk hero that we see in the Borderlands. And I'm
Yeah.
not an expert in this history, but I think it's really fascinating. And I want to talk a little bit about these figures and see what you have to say and see if I have anything smart to say about them and maybe we can learn something today.
Yeah. Awesome. Sounds
Yeah, we
cool.
can. I mean, if you want me to start with some of these, I mean, I go back to. I guess we could start with Juan Cortina. Juan Cortina, who is active in the Borderlands. Um, so a couple texts that I'm going to work from. Juan Gonzalez, he wrote Harvest of Empire, which is a history of Latinos in America, and several editions of this book have come out over the last decades. I think I have the second revised and updated edition, so like the 2022 edition, something like that.
Harvest
And
of
uh,
Empire.
and he
Okay.
talks a little bit about, in chapter 5, he talks about the experiences of Mexicans, Mexican Americans. He's talking about sort of this time period of the latter half of the 19th century and the early half of the 20th century. And he's talking about Mexican Americans facing a frustrating identity problem, being both native born and immigrants, pioneers and aliens, patriots and rebels.
Hmm.
No matter how, I'm recording here, no matter how far back some may trace their ancestry on our soil, they're still battling to emerge from the obscure margins of official U.S. history. So he talks about some of these individuals. In this chapter in particular, he talks about what he calls one pioneer Mexican American family, which was the Canales clan of South Texas. And so among these numerous individuals who were active on both sides of the border in this history going back from the 1700s up through the Mexican-American War. We've got one of these individuals is Juan Cortina, born in 1824, active in the Texas borderlands. And I'm trying to find here, what does he say about Juan Cortina? Let me pull up my notes here. While I'm looking, you have any questions or any thoughts so far on
Um.
uh
I.
yeah, I've got,
I
I've got
mean, I
stuff here
guess
on
the
him.
first thing that strikes me is like we went over some of this history last time and a time before that when you weren't on here, Mike, about sort of the history.
Hmm.
Obviously, the history of the United States taking land away from Mexico, right? Like taking
Yeah.
over all of this territory and basically disenfranchising people within what had been their own country, right? Because it's like we always think about Mexico in the like Americans, gringos, whatever, think about Mexico in the context of like immigration, but as a lot of folks will obviously tell you, like we didn't cross the border crossed us, right? It's like they we've America, the United States grabs up all of this land that is previously there's other people living that, there's just
Yep,
a population
exactly.
of folks living there. So when you talk about bandits, right, and folk heroes and people that turn to some form of crime or criminality, it makes sense in a way when you look at it from that point of view, because it's like people are being disenfranchised from their own land, their own territory, and I think that's naturally going to lead to some amount of banditry, right? That's
Yeah,
the
maybe we
first
should
thing that
talk.
pops
Maybe
into
we
my
should talk a
mind.
little bit about. Yeah, maybe we should talk a little bit about some numbers. I have some numbers on that to give you
Okay.
a sense of that. But yeah, it's a couple things
Yeah.
that I thought about. So we previously talked. We talked about the Porfiriato. We
Mm-hmm.
talked about this time period in Mexican history where Porfirio Diaz was the dictator from the 1880s, late 1870s, all the way up to 1910 when he was overthrown in the Mexican Revolution.
Right.
And we talked about, like you said, the dispossessions, the expropriations that occurred in Mexico and how this led to a greater increase in mass migration into the United States, among other issues, right? So we talked a lot about that history. Well, some
Mm-hmm.
of this stuff that we're going to talk about today kind of predates, or is really at the very beginning of the Porfiriato, this same time period, and it's
Mm.
outside, just like you say, it's outside of Mexico. We're talking about, or on the borderlands, right? So we're talking about, in this case. Yeah, the Canales family that Gonzalez is talking about, like, we're talking about when it was the 1820s through the 1830s, and then the beginning of the Texas. I think you've maybe spoken about you spoke about the Texas Revolution in a previous show.
Yeah.
So people who've watched that know a little bit about that. So this sort of putting it in that time period, the Texas Revolution, and then shortly after the Texas Revolution, and what's happening with these expropriations. And I've got some numbers here from Juan Gonzalez here. He's
Mm-hmm.
talking about 1850. So the Mexican-American War took place in 1846, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was 1848, I believe. I could be wrong here. When that was the treaty that essentially signed away half of Mexico to the United States for some $15 million or something like that. And so just a couple years later, we got 1850, property in Texas. I'm going to quote here from Gonzalez here. It says in 1850, property in Texas had been pretty evenly divided between Anglos. These are the new incoming, the Americans, the English-speaking Americans, and the Mexicans, the Tejanos. Right. In 1850, property in Texas had been pretty evenly divided between the two groups.
Mm-hmm.
That year, according to the U.S. Census, Tejanos, Mexican Texans, composed 32.4% of the workers in the state and owned 33% of its wealth. Over the next 20 years, however, things changed drastically. By 1870, Tejanos were 47.6% of the workforce, so a greater percent of the workforce, right? But possessed now only 10.6% of the wealth. So instead of having a third of the wealth, only
Right.
10% of the wealth. I'm going to keep quoting here. In South Texas, where Mexicans remain the overwhelming majority, one third of the ranches in all the large estates were in Anglo hands by 1900. Only the smaller Tejano farmers clung to their titles. And similar things happened. And in this book, he talks in a previous chapter about the Californios, which similar things happened in California as well. By hook or by crook, people were Mexican Americans, or they called them Californios or Tejanos or what, Mexicans were dispossessed of their land. And again, like you said, this is going to create rebels. This is going to create anger, and
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, so yeah, and it would violence also. Gonzalez tells us as well that violence, quote, violence against Mexicans became commonplace during this time. So it was people being dispossessed legally and extra legally as well.
Yes.
And yeah, of course, it's going to lead to these. And then Gonzalez says anybody who dares to stand up to this is labeled as a bandit or a rebel or something like that, right? And the most famous, he says, the most famous bandit. He calls it the most famous bandit of them all is Juan Cortina, Juan Cheno Cortina. I think most people probably haven't ever heard of this guy, so I kind of call into question this idea that he's the most famous bandit of them all. But he tells us about Cortina. He raised an army of 1,200 Mexicans to fight against Texas Rangers after an
Mm.
altercation where Cortina shot a U.S. Marshal from Brownsville, Texas. And so, yeah, so, he fought on both sides of the border here, and it's sort of a longer story that I don't know all the history behind it, and nor do I think he's the most interesting or the most important, but it is at least with Juan Cortina, it's somebody that we have like firm historical evidence of him and all of this stuff. Maybe the next guy, before we move on, but I mean, we can talk for a minute. But maybe the next guy we can talk about, Joaquin Murrieta, might the whole story might be fabricated. We don't know, but at least with Juan Cortina, we know that he existed. So thoughts
Uh,
on I don't really have much else
well,
to
what
say
was
about
Juan
Juan Cortina, but
Cortina?
yeah.
I guess like was he a rancher before being dispossessed? Like, what was his story? I guess before he became a bandit. I'm curious. Do you know much about that?
Let me
Um,
see. I don't have much information um on Juan Cortina. Let's see what I can find from the old interwebs here.
oh,
I mean,
okay.
he's from this large Canales family, right? So he's from this larger family. Wikipedia says Nepomuceno Cortina, also known by his nicknames Chano Cortina, the Red Robber of the Rio Grande, and the Rio Grande Robin Hood, was a Mexican rancher, politician, military leader, outlaw, and folk hero. An important caudillo. I guess that's an important thing to say as well.
Yeah,
So he was a landowner, right? He was somebody. A caudillo is a term that's used in all sorts of Latin American communities for this figure of like a strong man, a
this
Latin
is
American strong man, right? So yeah,
yeah. I
he led paramilitary forces. So he was able to organize these raids because he had resources already, and he had resources on both sides of the border, I believe. And this family was, a large, rich family. So he was able to, at some point, he left the United States and goes over into the it goes over into Mexico. He's born in Mexico, but he's in the United States. He goes back into, this is on the borderlands, right? So he goes to the other side of the border, and then he's able to organize these raids across the border,
yeah.
is my understanding. Yeah.
It's interesting. Yeah, I'm looking at the website of the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley, um, and they are saying that um, he fought. Cortina served under. Yeah, they were part of this. Yeah, like wealthier cattle ranching family. Cortina served under General Mariano Arista and fought in the battles of Resaca de la Palma and Palo Alto in the U.S.-Mexico War. He would later fight for both Mexico and France, switching sides twice during the Second Franco-Mexican War, and later
Yeah.
declaring himself governor of Tamaulipas. And then he was also leading sort of a uprising during the Civil War, kind of taking advantage of the Civil War to sort of attack to go against Texas and the Confederate
Yep.
states of Texas. So it's interesting that it seems like yeah he was part of this well-off ranching family, and presumably they got screwed over, right, in this whole
Yeah.
colonial project of seizing Mexican land. And then this guy, like you said, he had the resources to raise an army, raise forces, and he was kind of taking advantage of all this instability to try to no, I wouldn't say take revenge necessarily, but to
Yeah.
advance his position, right?
Yes,
After,
but what's
yeah,
interesting, sort of to fit into this larger story of the bandits and the rebels and these folk heroes, right, is that it becomes he becomes a folk hero, like a
yeah,
folk story, and he's sort of in the same vein as these other individuals who I think there's something there. It's telling us something
totally,
about the fact that the people in the borderlands like are just yearning for stories like he's not the only one who's referred to as like a Robin Hood. Joaquin Murrieta, I think, also
yeah,
referred to as the Robin Hood of the West, or the Robin Hood of El
yeah,
Dorado. And this guy might not have ever ever even existed, but this idea like became took hold in Mexican American California or Tejano or New Mexico. These communities of people who themselves were, they were yearning for some sort of, I don't know, not revenge. Well, maybe we talk about the Plan de San Diego. There's some revenge there, but retribution or
or
justice,
just
or
yeah. I mean, anybody,
just justice. Yeah,
and I mean, yeah. There's different, whether it's revenge, whether it's justice. It's like that's kind of subjective, but it's like when people are completely screwed over and disenfranchised, and especially people like Juan Cortina that used to have a better position, right? Used to be in a
yep,
more secure position. There's naturally going to be some desire to, to right those wrongs, so to speak, or to set it straight. And whether or not this guy is like a noble, whether we think he's a hero or not, people are going to see him that way because they are looking for anybody, right? Anybody that can stand up against Texas and these
Yep.
rapacious like colonial regimes. So makes sense to me. Interesting guy. And he was part of a whole clan, I guess, of people you're saying who were maybe some of them.
Well,
Yeah.
what Gonzalez tries to tell us in this chapter, he uses the Canales clan
Hmm.
as sort of like, through their story, we can see this story of dispossession, and it's sort of at the end of the story, we have um, uh, what is his name? Fiacro Salazar, the great great grandson of Luciano Canales, one of the diehards who was able to hold on to a couple hundred acres of the old ranch, which was a much larger ranch, right? This large family ranch. But here in 1992, Salazar, San Antonio Army engineer, he's being interviewed, and he talks about, they have a couple hundred acres, but he says, quote, "They had to protect it with guns." Another quote, "Any poor fellow who didn't lost it." Right.
Yeah.
So Gonzalez tells us, even as thousands lost their land, though, other Mexicans kept migrating into the Southwest. And so, this is a whole nother part of the story, which we'll talk about as well. But more than a million are coming into the region between 1900 and 1930. So we have new Mexicans as well who are right. So, and the borderland is fluid, right? We shouldn't necessarily think we kind of need to think transnationally a little bit
Yes.
about a lot of
Yes.
these communities and how they are, movement across the border was easy. And for a lot of these communities, especially in South Texas, for example, there's a lot of crossing over and mixing between these communities. So
Yeah. Um, this is again from the University of uh, University of Texas Rio Grande Valley. I thought this little conclusion they wrote was interesting. It says, "Legacy of Juan Cortina. Cortina's action against the Confederacy and protection of Mexico earned him a place among Unionists, especially after the U.S. Civil War ended. Citizens and leaders of Brownsville embraced him and even endorsed his petition for an official pardon from the legislature. He was honored by the Mexican government, which appointed him brigadier general. However, his incursions against Texas landowners and ranchers continued, and Cortina was eventually arrested in 1875 and confined to Mexico City. Released in 1876, Cortina returned to Tamaulipas, but when his friend and one-time ally Porfirio Diaz seized the presidency, Cortina was
Mm,
again arrested. Some speculate that
okay.
Diaz feared Cortina, while others believe Diaz was pressured by the U.S. or paid off by wealthy Texans. Whatever the motivation, Juan Cortina remained in Mexican custody until his death in 1894. His legacy of resistance inspired generations of Tejanos who also fought for justice and equality, as well as those who seek to preserve the unique culture and traditions of Mexican Americans. So
Yeah,
that's
well put.
interesting there. Like Diaz, double crosses him basically
Yep.
and puts him in
Because
jail.
he could be a threat, right? He's a
Yeah.
popular figure even then, and then his
Yeah.
his popularity continues after his death, and he's able to inspire others through corridos and Gregorio Cortez. We could talk about as well, who the corrido was written about him. I do
Hmm.
want to talk about this Joaquin
Yeah, yeah.
Murrieta.
Who was
If nothing
Joaquin
else, because
Murrieta?
so he was from California. Let me read you from a book it was published in the late 80s called Mexican American Folklore that I was able to obtain recently by John O. West. And just to quickly, he says Joaquin Murrieta, a Latin working peacefully in the California mines, was forced into outlaw, according to tradition, by Anglo miners who had raped and or killed his beautiful wife. He formed a sort of vigilante gang and raided successfully the miners and others of the usurping race that had taken over Spanish California because of the gold rush. And
Hmm.
he goes. This is a book that sort of explores these figures such as Joaquin Murrieta. Joaquin Murrieta may or may not have actually existed. I guess I'm not an expert in this history, but from what I'm discovering, there were newspaper articles perhaps about a figure such as this, but most of what we know about Juan Joaquin Murrieta, excuse me, um, who also know, like I said, also known as the Robin Hood of the West, comes from a novel. So it's a fictionalized version of his story called The
Hmm.
Life and Adventures of Joaquin Murrieta, the celebrated California bandit, that was published in 1854. Murrieta supposedly was killed a year earlier. So it's a sort of fictionalized. Is this true to what do we know? This book, fascinating. I think it's fascinating. Written by John Ridge, who if you know Native American history, you perhaps if you know the history of the Cherokee, this sort of seems like sort of a diversion, but I think it's an interesting just coincidence. This these different histories coming together. So John Ridge, his father was Major Ridge. Major Ridge was one of those Cherokee leaders who had signed the Treaty of New Echota. I believe, was that the treaty that he signed? Whatever the treaty was that sent the Cherokee off to Oklahoma to Indian Territory. And this was a treaty that was widely unpopular among the Cherokee. This treaty party was seen as unrepresentative by most of the Cherokee. And there was actually a law that had been passed by the Cherokee government years earlier that had basically said if you're a member of there had been treaty parties in the past that had been selling off Cherokee lands. So it said basically outlawed this practice. So in doing so, they had essentially committed a crime according to the Cherokee law. But John and Ridge and Major Ridge had always maintained that doing so had maintained Cherokee sovereignty. The only other alternative would have been the total dissolution of their tribe. And so while it was seen as a widely unpopular move, they and their descendants have always maintained that this was a way to maintain sovereignty for the Cherokee people. Long story short, everybody's moved the Trail of Tears, this horrific story that we can't get into too much, but lots of people lost their lives as they were forced into Oklahoma and the Indian Territory, the reservations there. And eventually Major Ridge was executed by a group of Cherokee, basically murdered, but it was seen as an execution because essentially he had signed his own death warrant because he had signed this treaty years earlier. Well, his son had killed one of those who he thought was responsible for killing his father and was an outlaw and was on the run and was in California in the 1850s. John Ridge, this Cherokee sort of outlaw from the Cherokee Nation and from the United States, and so here he is in California, the gold rush. He's trying to find his fortune, and what does he do? He writes a novel, The Life and Adventures of Joaquin Murrieta, that becomes this sort of best-selling novel, and it's from this story that all of these other legends and stories of Joaquin Murrieta are published, and there's like a French version of it that's published, and so then historians later have gone to try to figure out, who was the real Joaquin Murrieta? Did he even exist? Is this just a fictionalized account of the hopes and dreams of the people of California, the downtrodden people? Very much see this novel is very much seen as like a novel that celebrates the dispossessed and the downtrodden, and
Right.
Joaquin Murrieta is celebrated as like a heroic figure. So
Yeah.
I know I'm just kind of rambling here. So yeah, thoughts, questions about this?
Um, it's really interesting. I mean, I can't. I mean, I don't know. Do modern historians think that this guy was real, or there's varying thoughts about that?
There's varying thoughts about
Okay.
the real I like I said, I'm not an expert in this particular history, and so I've only really read secondary sources, and this book that I just said that uh, although I'll read here again from John O. West, Mexican American Folklore. He says, although the whole story may well be fabrication, it has gone into legend much as the story of Gregorio Cortez has, and we'll talk about Gregorio Cortez, who was very much a real figure. And he says it's significant that details of the Murrieta story abound in cruelty and bloody deeds, which are presumably typical to Anglos, typical to Anglos of the stereotypical Mexicans, but only appropriate to members of the beleaguered race. What else is a man? Who is really a man to do? I'm confused by what I just read here. But anyway, long story short, then he goes into, likening this to Pancho Villa, Dorotea Arango. So, like I said, I've only read a few secondary sources. I think it's a fascinating story. It's unclear whether he's, looking at the Wikipedia page, right? There's mostly this fictionalized account, but historians, more recent historians, have gone to try to discover who was the real Joaquin Murrieta. There's a controversy over his life. Historian Susan Lee Johnson says, so many tales have grown up around Murrieta that it is hard to disentangle the fabulous from the factual. There seems to be a consensus that Anglos drove him from a rich mining claim, and that in rapid succession his wife was raped, his half-brother lynched, and Murrieta himself horsewhipped. He may have worked as a monte dealer for a time, then according to whichever version one accepts, he became either a horse trader, an occasional horse thief, or a bandit, right? And then one other fascinating thing here, the figure of Zorro was written in the early 20th century, was said to have, the guy who wrote the story, Johnston McCulley, was said to have based his character, Don Diego de la Vega, Zorro, in his 1919 novel on John Ridge's 1854 novel, the Murrieta novel, the life and adventures of Joaquin Murrieta. So, whether he was real or not, or how much of this was real, it's unclear.
Yeah. Well, I found this. I looked him up on like newspapers.com, and I found this article, and yeah, it's like somebody talking about how he never died, and or like he
Yeah.
he
What
wasn't
year
killed.
was this article from?
The
What
article
year
is
is the
from
article
1932, so it's it's
Okay.
like legend. Like these events are supposed to have happened in what, the 1840s or 50s.
1850s. He was
1850s.
supposedly 1853. There's an article just linked. I should have done some more research. I've not done any primary research on this, so this is all secondary research of mine. But it looks like on the Wikipedia page there's a link to a story, the Daily Alta, California, from 1853 about Joaquin Murrieta, and it's just like a story about this guy. I'm looking at it right now. The various accounts of the capture and decapitation of the notorious Joaquin Murrieta. And so it's like, even then, it's like 1853, this story about, there's various stories about this guy.
Yeah.
And then in 1855, was it 1855 or 1850? Yeah, 1854, 1855, John Ridge writes his book. 1854, he writes his book, right? So it's just basically, it seems to me like there are stories, there are legends, maybe based on a true individual, maybe based on an amalgamation of individuals, similar stories, I'm sure were familiar to people in their own, Californios were familiar with stories just from their own experiences, or their family or friends telling them about individuals who were driven off of their mine, who were working their trying to stake their claim, and then for whatever reason, by violence, by legal or extra legal means, they were forced off and then forced into a life of crime and banditry, and then they become folk heroes.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know very much about the gold rush, but I would imagine that would create a lot of violence, right?
Yeah.
A lot of tension.
Yep,
and
exactly.
fighting over resources and money, presumably. So whether there was actually a guy named Joaquin Murrieta who all of this stuff happened to or not, we can presume that, yeah, this is probably based on something, and there were people that were disenfranchised or wronged in some way, and that there was revenge taken. I'd be curious to look more into this. Yeah, I found this.
Yep.
I found this whole article. Yeah, like I said, it's this article about he wasn't killed in 1853. He actually lived, and but they have.
He lives within all of us. So.
Yeah, it's like a sketch. It's like the picture I chose for the broadcast thumbnail is like this really sort of like charcoal sketch of a guy, and they're like, "This is Joaquin Murrieta." So it's interesting. They're also referencing
there was another
a head.
guy. Go ahead. Yeah, the head. Okay, yeah.
Or no, they're saying there was a
because he was decapitated, supposedly.
There was a head displayed in San Francisco, supposedly, and this guy's saying, no, that head wasn't his. But yeah, I don't know. But it's an interesting story. So
this is a time when they're, how do we really know? Right, that's the question. Right, we're based on witness testimony because there are no photographs of this individual, and So we don't have flock cameras everywhere to figure out who he is and where he is and if he's real. There is another individual from California who was real, Tiburcio Vasquez, who
Uh-huh.
was from California, Alta California, Mexico, Monterrey. Born in the 1830s, so he was a little bit later, and he was executed by the state in 1875 in California for murder. I mean, he did all sorts. I mean, he was also a celebrated figure who did a number of things. Again, I'm not an expert in this history, but sort of similar story. I'm looking at why did he run off here?
I got
Well, from what I understand, he became kind of a bandit. Even though he had been educated, even though he came from somewhat of a prominent family, and his great grandfather apparently had been on an early expedition in 1776, so he was sort of a well-off middle class family. He was educated, he spoke English, he spoke Spanish, but for whatever reason in the 1850s, he became associated with another bandit, Anastasio Garcia. Garcia was involved in the killing of the constable in 1854. Tiburcio Vasquez was apparently there,
mm-hmm.
but he said he didn't have anything to do with it. This was at a dance, at a fandango. And so he went on the run. He was an outlaw. He becomes an outlaw, and what outlaws do. He's committing crimes. What is he doing? He's cattle thefts, highway robberies, murders, apparently, because he does get eventually convicted of murder, burglaries. He's sent to prison. He is in 1866. It looks like he's captured after a burglary, sent to prison for 3 years. Um, and then after that, he's out. He's a bandit again. He is involved in a gunfight with a police officer. Eventually, it just goes on. I mean, the story goes on and on and on. But eventually, he's captured. Uh,
Yeah. What?
Despite the execution, despite being arrested, despite being guilty of all these things, right? His leg is just like the rest of these guys. He's got a legacy of seen as somebody, as a character, especially I'd say with him, especially from what I understand, especially after his story sort of re-examined in the Chicano movement in the 60s and 70s. There's a play that was put out about him in the early 1980s, I believe, by um, the what is his name, Luis Valdez, who
Mm.
was a Chicano playwright who he directed the movie in the it was 87. He directed the movie La Bamba, but before that he had directed a film called Zoot Suit, which was a adaptation of a play that he had done in the 1970s. So he was a Chicano, and he worked with Cesar Chavez in the 1960s. So he was this Chicano activist, playwright, and part of this re-examining of history. And so in 1982, he did a play Bandito, which helped sort of popularize this story of Tiburcio Vasquez. Kind of re-examining this guy as a real figure whose story, in some ways, might be seen as mirroring this perhaps fictionalized story of Joaquin Murrieta.
Yeah. Um that's well, to me it's interesting. This guy, it's like he's not really a criminal until they go after him, according to this
Yeah.
story, basically. Like he's present during, a killing of a sheriff by somebody else, and then they go after him, and then he's like, all right, well, I'm going to become a bandit. So it's an
I'll
interesting
read about his
life story.
yeah about his death here. So apparently like I said, he was sort of forgotten over those decades. Um, he was seen as a popular figure, at least among some, during the time, even when he was arrested. It says visitors flocked to his cell, many of them women. He signed autographs, posed for photographs, sold photos from the window of his cell to use the money for his legal defense. But which, he was convicted. He appealed for clemency, but that was denied, and he was executed 1875, 39 years old. And, so yeah, that's the end of him. But is it the end of him? Because the story lives on, and we can talk about him and see him as a figure. I don't know, to be necessarily emulated or to understand where the where the rebellion comes from, and the situation that people found themselves, and in the the constrained choices that they had, and people who wanted to have some agency and who had some pride in themselves, who fought back, were automatically labeled as bandits. And so you might as well become a bandit, right?
Yeah.
And fight for yourself, and fight for, and so even if these individuals are morally ambiguous in some ways, the popular, people in the popular culture like to celebrate these figures. They're Robin Hood figures because, it gives them some hope for, like we said, justice or retribution in some ways. And there was some hope for retribution among at least some of the people in these communities.
Yeah. Well, I think anytime this is not a phenomena that is this is not a phenomenon that is exclusive to the borderlands in between Mexico and America and the United States in the late 19th, early 20th century. This is something that is universal in a way. Is that people oftentimes there is this like idolization of bandits and outlaws and criminals, and sometimes these people are very morally ambiguous or even like awful, but for some reason there is at least a certain segment of the population that wants to paint them as heroes. So that is a very interesting phenomenon in and of itself, and I think it goes around. I think there's examples of this all over the world. I know I would like to dig this up, but I know there's examples of people like this in Brazil, like around the same time period. There's some pretty famous, like legendary social bandits. They're called, who would dress up in these really flamboyant outfits, and they were, there's a lot of legends about those guys, and they were sort of seen. Some of them were seen as Robin Hood figures, and of course, in the United States, we have like Pretty Boy Floyd and all of these Depression era gangsters.
Hmm.
They were, some of them were supposedly like Pretty Boy Floyd allegedly would destroy mortgage records or something while he was robbing banks. I don't know if that's true or not. That's just a legend, right? So
Yep.
whether it's true, whether it's not, whether it's partially true, people do tend to want to see something beyond just like pure individualist like criminality in these people, right? They want to see
Yep.
something more broad based and more like of retribution, right? For the people that have all
Hmm.
the money and the power, they say, oh well, at least somebody's standing up against them, So it is interesting, right? These figures. Um. Okay.
Should we go back to Texas?
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's go back to Texas. Let's talk about Gregorio Cortez. The
Okay.
Ballad of Gregorio Cortez. Speaking of films, so there was a film made in 1982 about this. It's called The Ballad of Gregorio Cortez because there's the corrido of Gregorio Cortez, which had been sung and still is sung on the borderlands. This is an individual who, again, born in Mexico, but these communities are fluid, so he's living in the United States. He's on his ranch. Him and his brothers are on his ranch in what is it, 1901, I believe it is. Yeah, looking at when this happened, a miscommunication. Something happened. Somebody had sold a horse. His brother had sold a horse or had sold a mare. Where he was asked. So, long story short, sheriffs show up. He was accused. Basically, there was this question about a horse theft, right?
Uh huh.
So they show up. The authorities don't really speak Spanish. Maybe they think they speak Spanish, because they try to question Gregorio Cortez and his brother in Spanish. They ask him if they had sold a horse. And they use the word caballo in Spanish is
Right.
for, I guess, male horse. And so there was a response. Gregorio, his brother, apparently had said no, and had said in Spanish that he'd sold a mare, which was the female horse, right? So there's this question about, is he lying? So they accuse him of lying. Yes, you did. You sold this horse. And he said no. Well, why did he say no? Because he said, no, I sold a mare. Right. So
Right.
at least that's the story.
Uh huh.
There's an altercation happened. Gregorio Cortez ends up shooting the sheriff, but he did not shoot the deputy. No, I don't know. Uh, but then I don't know, for some reason I think of Bob Marley's "I Shot the Sheriff" when I hear this story, right? Because it is the story,
Well,
right?
yeah.
Um,
I mean, that's another
but
example, right?
yeah, so yeah, he shoots the sheriff in self-defense. His brother's shot. He goes on the run. And so he's basically on the run. And so the story of Gregorio Cortez and the ballad of Gregorio Cortez, the corrido of Gregorio Cortez, is this story of how he's able to be on the run for a period of time. And he's eventually captured. He's eventually put on trial. He is eventually let out. He's found not guilty because of the how much publicity had been around this story. I guess he got I don't remember the details of this story, but he dies later. He dies in 1916, like a decade after all of these events were over. But there's some question even then about whether he had been poisoned or he was sentenced. I'm looking here at he was sentenced and then he was pardoned. So he was
Okay.
eventually pardoned. So he served a number of years, not sentenced to death, eventually pardoned in 1913, but then he dies in 1916. And there's this question about the cause of death: heart attack, pneumonia.
Right.
Was he poisoned? Was this retribution because he'd been pardoned? And so, I don't know about any of that stuff. But again, this just adds to the legend, the story about him. And so, and a couple of things have been, there's a couple things we might mention. A famous book has been written about him, a 1958 book, With His Pistol in His Hand, written by Americo Paredes, who was an academic and a guy who wrote extensively about and sort of chronicled and helped to preserve really a lot of the Mexican American folklore of the borderlands. And so he talks about, even in the 1950s, he's talking about Gregorio Cortez and how his story, how did he become such a big story, and how did he become this legendary figure through the song, the corrido, and just the cultural significance of all of this. And then even, not quite 50 or 40, 30 years later, in the 80s, 1982, there's this movie, The Ballad of Gregorio Cortez, with Edward James Olmos playing the title figure of Gregorio Cortez. That film mostly based on that earlier book that I mentioned, the Paredes With His Pistol in His Hand. So yeah, so these stories live on. They get to, retold, and yeah, thoughts.
Um, it's really interesting. I don't. I mean, I think this really clearly illustrates what we were talking about, sort of at the top of the show, like the fact that a lot of this banditry is driven by dispossession or by uh, the settler colonialist process, right? Because he basically committed this crime because his family was basically being harassed by Anglo, Texas Rangers or sheriffs or
Yep.
whatever, people that are coming around and harassing his family, right? So it's
I think the story is he was in the middle of shaving.
yeah,
I don't know why that detail pops in my head, but he was in the middle of shaving. The indignity, they just show up and
yeah, yeah.
start bossing them around.
So right, so I think
I don't think I imagined that fact about him shaving,
I
although I
trust
might
you with
have.
it. It's I mean, all of this stuff, it's long enough ago and there's so much myth making that it's probably really hard. Even the ones that are
Oh,
better
here's where I got it from.
documented, you know.
This is from Latino USA, a cartoon history. I don't know if you've ever seen that book, illustrated by a Chicano artist, Lalo Alcaraz, but it was written
No.
by a Mexican academic. And he's got this little, it's sort of a graphic novelized version of this history, of all of this history. And I've just got a page here. The plight of Gregorio Cortez. It says Gregorio Cortez was in his home in El Carmen, Texas, shaving near his family. And they've got a picture of his like wife and daughter just like staring at him as he's shaving. Maybe that's why it's stuck in my head. I don't know the detail. For some reason, that detail always. A sheriff comes to ask him about a missing mare. Cortez misunderstands him. The sheriff shoots Cortez's brother. Cortez shoots the sheriff, thus becoming an outlaw. The authorities
Right.
announced the reward of $3,000 to capture Cortez, and he's sought by sheriffs and rangers. Cortez eludes the authorities, but eventually he's captured, put on trial, found not guilty, but one of his enemies finds a solution to once again put him on trial for having stolen a mare. That's what it is. He's found guilty of that and sentenced to 99 years and a day. Less than a year later, Abraham Lincoln's daughter asked the Texas governor for clemency. Cortez is
Oh,
free,
interesting.
is set free, but his enemies end up poisoning him. I mean, that's unclear. This is a cartoon history, so I guess it looks like Ilan Stavans is playing. The author is playing, a little bit loose with the. Yeah, well, how much do we really know? So what they say is his enemies poison him. He's buried somewhere in Matamoros, Brownsville, or Laredo. And
Yeah.
then it says people on the Texas-Mexico border still sing a corrido in Cortez's memory. Yeah. So.
I think anybody, like I said, it's like anybody that stands up against, this process of settler colonialism, these Anglo Americans kind of sweeping through the land and taking it over. I think anybody that stands up against that is going to basically be glorified no matter who they are or what their motivations are. That's the interesting thing because we have different
Hmm.
groups of people here that we've been talking about. We have um, like the first guy, Juan Cortina, who's from
Hmm.
like a more well-off established family. We have this guy who may or may not have existed. The what's his name?
Murieta.
Morieta.
Joaquin.
Yeah, Joaquin Morieta, who's like a just a
But
poor,
but but
gold
he
miner.
lives on with on all of us. I assume, not to get you sidetracked from your point, but I assume, I don't know if I'm right, but there's a 1967 poem, I Am Joaquin,
Oh,
by Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez, and this is like a really influential Chicano poem. And he just goes through the history. He never, if as far as I understand, in the poem never says exactly who Joaquin is, but that's my guess. Is he talking about Joaquin Murrieta? This California figure. But anyway, you're
right.
saying
Well, my
I
point, yeah,
totally
I
distract
think
you. Yeah.
my point is just that, and I think you agree. It's like these are diverse people, right? Like they're all Mexicans or like Latinos or whatever,
Hmm.
but they are come from different. Some of them are wealthier, some of them are poor.
Hmm.
They're in different circumstances when they make some sort of act of resistance, right, or like stand of resistance. And there's different they have different motivations for doing so. But the important part is the fact that they are standing up in some way to these sort of colonialists, right? Like these Anglo-American interlopers, invaders, right? And that
Yep.
and that is that's the important part, right? And they become part of this legend for that reason, I guess is my point.
Hmm.
And it says he was a tenant farmer,
Yep.
Gregorio Cortez. So it's like maybe that's so. That this is it's all part of the process of disenfranchisement, right? And whether you're part of the former elite that is like pushed aside, or whether you're part of the lower classes, so to speak. Anybody who stands up against this process is going to be remembered, right? In some way, is if they make it into the history books, right? They're going to be like glorified in some way, and it makes sense. Um, I don't have anything else to say about Gregorio
Well,
Cortez. I'd like to learn more about it.
can we talk just briefly, and then I think I probably out of things to say after this, but just that we know that there were other outlaws and bandits in the borderlands that I think we've talked about in the past. The Partido Liberal Mexicano,
Yes.
the uh, the so-called Magonistas, followers of Ricardo Flores Magón and his brother Enrique Flores Magón, based in well at different times in different parts of the American Southwest, but eventually they have their headquarters in Los Angeles. They're active in the from the 1903 through 19 mid 1910s. They're active, all trying to foment revolution, being part of the Mexican Revolution. Eventually the Mexican Revolution does take off in Mexico. Porfirio Diaz is overthrown, and the Flores Magón brothers remain in Los Angeles. Many of their followers are on both sides of the border, but while the revolution is taking place, a lot of the so-called Magonistas continue to live in Texas in New Mexico, in Arizona, in Los Angeles, right? So there are these communities of Magonistas and these different local groups, even though by the by 1915, 1916, the PLM as an organization is sort of waning. There are still these local organizations that consider themselves to be, like PLM clubs or,
Yeah.
liberal clubs that are affiliated with, and even though the newspapers being produced somewhat inconsistently by 1916, 1915. There's still a lot of Magonistas in this area, and then there's this other thing that kind of gets attributed to the Magonistas that the Magonistas came out in support of, that there were Magonistas involved in, but it was not uh, done at the behest of the PLM, and that's this thing known as the Plan of San Diego or the Plan de Santiago.